So we're going to actually move on to something that's quite related. I want to welcome back Nicholas Lloyd, our historian anthropologist from the UK. It's been a little while since we've had him on our town hall. And Nicholas is going to speak to us about some ancient Roman historical battle, I think. So, and it's something like, in fact, what Jacques and I are playing chess with right now. So is Nicholas on?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Good.
All right.
Hey, Nicholas, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I was waving.
Great, and Happy New Year to you.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Congrats on the new place.
Yes, got some lovely cornicing. Oops. There we go. There's the cornicing. Lovely cornicing. Right.
Excellent.
Yes. Well, earlier last year in this series of talks, I talked about the Punic Wars, and this time I thought I'd talk about the greatest of the battles that took place in the Punic Wars, and one of the greatest battles that ever took place, ever, frankly, which was the Battle of Cannae. That's C-A-N-N-A-E, Cannae. And this took place in August of 216 BC. And in command of the Carthaginians was the very famous General Hannibal. And I'll get on to exactly who was commanding the Romans in a bit. I suppose I have to do a little bit of scene setting, but I don't want to repeat much of what I was saying about the Punic Wars that I've already said. So this is the Second Punic War. Carthage lost the first one. It was largely settled with naval battles, and as a largely private enterprise, the Barcid family, that is Hannibal and two of his brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, they decided to just fight a private war, and they would do it on land. They would go, they started in Spain, they went over through Gaul, down through Italy, crossing the Alps. I know a picture of some Alps. There you go. There's a picture. No, there it is. There's a picture of Hannibal crossing the Alps with some. There's what the elephants. There are the elephants. Okay. And that's what he's probably most famous for, but really it shouldn't be. It's his military victories after that. In fact, crossing the Alps was a bit of a disaster. He lost loads of men. Anyway, he ended up in northern Italy, which was Gaul at that point. It was full of Gauls who were not friends at all with the Romans at this point. They were positively hostile, just fought a war, and they allied with Hannibal, and he then fought a load of battles, and just to cut things really short, he won all of them, some of them very decisively. The last big battle before Cannae was at Lake Trasimene, and he managed with his army to ambush the entire Roman army with his entire army, possibly the only time that's ever been done in history, and absolutely annihilated them. And Rome was in a state of shock. The Romans weren't used to losing. We're Romans, we always win. Who is this guy? How did he do that? Anyway, Rome was just one city, and it had the immediate countryside around it was its natural homeland, if you like, the rustic Latin-speaking area. But that was the heartland of Rome. We think today of Rome as Italy, because we think in terms of nation states. But no, Rome was just a city, and it had subjugated an awful lot of the rest of Italy. People like the Etruscans and the Samnites and so forth were now having to contribute forces to the Roman army and pay tribute and all the rest of it, pay taxes. And so they were subjugated nations. And the way to beat the Romans, it seems, is you strip away those subjugated nations. They're often referred to as the allies, but a lot of them didn't really want to be allies, but perhaps were ripe for being liberated from these nasty Romans. So along comes Hannibal saying, hey, join me and we'll defeat Rome and that'll be good for everyone. But even though he'd been fighting the Romans for 2 years, no one had joined him. Yes, the Gauls in the north had joined him where he originally set off, but none of the subjugated nations, not people like the Etruscans and the Samnites, none of them had joined. And he was probably really expecting them to join, but that hadn't happened. So he really needed a big victory to perhaps convince them all, actually, I think this guy could actually beat Rome. Maybe we should swap sides. But they didn't want to swap sides because Romans were not a forgiving lot. They really weren't. And if you did swap sides against the Romans and betray them, if you like, they were never even the tiniest bit lenient. So they were very reluctant to swap sides unless they were really certain that this Hannibal guy could actually pull it off and win. Then came the Battle of Cannae. Now, Rome, as I said, had been thrown into a bit of a panic. Now, the Romans were constantly terrified of someone becoming king. To call someone king, that was an insult. That was a way of saying, "Oh, you're so big for your boots, you want to be king," and that makes you a dangerous person because we don't want kings. We're a republic. We don't like kings. So they always had two consuls at once. They would elect every year two consuls to command the army, and they would split the army into two. The idea being no one could ever become king then because the other consul would come along and save the day. Trouble is that this Hannibal guy was really good, and everything they tried before, he just annihilated them. So they took a risk and they combined the two consular armies into one army. But there was also another mechanism to stop one guy becoming king, and that was that they had alternating command. So you got to command the entire army on Monday, but then the other consul, he got to command on Tuesday. Then it was back to you on Wednesday. You can see that if you're trying to fight a consistent war with consistent strategy, this is not necessarily a really good tactic, but it's one which they often put into the field because they were so terrified of someone grabbing the whole army and becoming king, which of course is what Julius Caesar would later effectively do, though he wouldn't call himself king. Anyway, they had decided, right, it may be a bit of a hammer to crack a nut, but the thing to do is to put just such an enormous army in the field with all the allies we can get together that he can't possibly win. If we just put just the biggest army that we've ever, possibly anyone has ever put together in the field, we'll just annihilate him. Normally we put a 2-legion army under the command of a consul, and maybe he might have another 2 legions roughly equal of allies. But if we put 2 lots together with all the allies, that'll be 8 legions. Let's double it. Hell, let's put 16 legions in the field. And actually, we're not completely sure. They had at least 16. They might have had 18. But I don't want to get bogged down in the controversy of that. But they had at least 16. This was the biggest army they'd ever put to the field. Right. He can't possibly use some trickery, some little ruse to defeat that, because all we need to do is put all our guys in one great big block and say, right, guys, forwards and engage the enemy. What could go wrong? He's always doing these little ambushes. Every single victory he had up until this point involved an ambush. He would hide troops somewhere and they would spring out, and that would turn the tide in his favor. So you could imagine they were really frightened of an ambush. Now here I'm conjecturing. My feeling is, and I haven't read this in any history book, this is just me, that Hannibal, and we do know that he was very well aware of what the Romans were planning and doing. So he was well aware that the Romans were putting an enormous army in the field. And he knew exactly where it was, and he knew pretty much when it was going to arrive. I think he thought to himself, this is a vastly bigger army than the Romans have ever put in the field. They have no experience of controlling that many troops. So they're actually straitjacketed. All they can do is put all their men into one big lump and tell them to just go forwards, because they don't have the command and control to do anything more complicated. They might try something more complicated, but they're also quite sensible, and they'll probably know that trying anything more complicated than that is almost certain to go wrong. So they'll just keep it simple. Guys, just go forwards, advance and engage the enemy. So let's think of the problems of command and control. Now, the battle took place on a flat plain, the plain around Cannae. Cannae was a city, a fortified city, which had a grain reserve in it. It had a grain reserve in it because the Romans had ordered all the farmers all around their subjugated parts of Italy to harvest early and stick their harvest in a fortified place so that Hannibal couldn't get it. But Hannibal was able to take with his whole army this one small fortified town of Cannae, and was able to get some food for a while. But would that be enough? According to Livy, Hannibal was down to just 10 days supply of food when the battle took place, and so perhaps they could have just waited for him to starve. But anyway, he's on this big plain, and some estimate, the biggest estimate I've come across is that the frontage was 5 miles across. When they put out these 16 or 18 legions plus the cavalry on the wings, that would stretch over 5 miles. I think that's an overestimate, not least because the Romans, we're told by Polybius, formed up unusually deep. And I think they probably formed up very deep in order to keep their frontage smaller because of this command and control problem. But even if we go to the opposite, let's say they had a frontage of only 2,000 yards. Okay, so if someone's 2,000 yards away, how do you get a message to him? Don't forget, there's no such thing as a battlefield. This isn't just a plain like you see in the movies. It's farmland, it's fences, it's orchards, it's hedges, it's flocks of sheep, it's barns, it's olive groves, it's all that. So it's going to take a guy on a horse a long time to get up 2,000 yards to deliver your message. You could blow a trumpet. He's not going to hear you if he's 2,000 yards away. Maybe a relay of trumpets at the start of the battle could get a message to him. But once the battle has started and you've got loads of guys kicking up dust and tramping on the ground, making noise, and then weapons start clashing and people are screaming, no one's going to hear a trumpet 2,000 yards away. Not a hope in hell. So trying to coordinate, okay, we'll do this, we'll pen them, and then you come round to this, anything fancy like that, it's not going to happen. So let's just put everyone in one big block, blow the trumpet, which is just go, and then that's it. Forwards they go. So I think that Hannibal guessed that that's what the Romans were going to do, and it is what they eventually did, and formed his plan accordingly, because history tells us that Hannibal was brilliant and that everything that happened after that that led to the disaster was according to plan. He'd seen it all coming. I don't want to get involved into the controversy of which side of the river they were and which way they were facing, but essentially he put out a screen of light troops which would allow him to form up behind those troops unseen. So from the Roman side, looking across the plain, you would just see the troops at the front, his light skirmishers. And behind that, he formed up his Celts and Spanish in the middle. Now, Polybius says that they were alternating, which could mean Spanish, all the Celts, and then Spanish again, or it could mean Spanish Celts, Spanish Celts, Spanish Celts, Spanish Celts in lots of little blocks. I think the latter of those two interpretations is the more likely. And these formed a crescent, a bulge towards the enemy, like that, a convex line of troops. Whether that was completely deliberate or it just happened, it could happen by accident, of course, because the troops are forming up over very large distances. It's going to be difficult to see exactly where you are. But by accident or design, they formed up in at one point, Livy calls it a wedge, but let's call it a crescent. And then either side of that wedge, he had his African troops. These were his veterans from Carthage, and they were armed with spears. They were very well armed. At this point, they actually looked just like the Romans because they're all wearing looted kit that they'd nicked from the previous battle. And what is possible is that these were in columns either side of the crescent, like this. So you've got a crescent with a column either side of it, which means that viewed from the front of these columns seem quite narrow. So the Romans would be looking all around, where are the rest of their African troops? Because it looks as though there aren't that many African troops from the front. Where are they? They're probably over that hill or behind those olive groves over there or somewhere. But even though the Romans outnumbered Hannibal something like 2-1, 2-1 at most, I think that's the most generous you can be, but a lot certainly, they didn't outnumber them with cavalry. So it was possible for the Carthaginians to stop the Romans using their cavalry to roam around and scout looking for this ambush, which didn't actually exist. The cavalry, as was standard, formed up on the wings either side. So you've got a block of Roman infantry opposite this crescent with two flanking columns of spearmen either side, and then cavalry on the wings. When the battle started, I believe that the Romans gave the only order they could: advance and engage the enemy. Who was in command of the Romans? Well, there were two main consuls, Paulus and Varro. These had just been elected. Varro was a commoner, son of a butcher, a rabble-rouser, a demagogue. The patricians didn't like him. The aristocratic senators thought very little of this upstart, whereas Paulus, Aemilius Paulus, he was our guy. He had, the fancy clothes, he talked posh, and he was one of us. He wore the gold ring of a senator and all the rest of it. He was from a very aristocratic background, and he died during the battle. So it was possible for the historians to give him a very heroic death. And this they do, both Polybius and Livy and other writers they all give slightly different heroic deaths for him, but they all talk about how he went down fighting with the men trying to save the day. Yeah, he was a great guy, was Paulus. But maybe Paulus was actually in command, because we are told quite definitely that Varro was on the right with the Roman cavalry and the Roman citizens. So that he was on the right with the allied, is what I meant to say, which meant that Paulus was on the left with the Roman cavalry, which is actually normally the position of honor. That's normally where the main commander would be. So perhaps actually he was in command of the whole army that day. Or was it, as I suspect, that they gave up on this alternating days thing, because they just thought, there aren't enough of us to command this army. They used the proconsuls from the previous year as sub-commanders. So there were actually at least 3 and probably 4 Roman commanders dotted along the lines of the Romans, just trying to hold everything together, because one guy could not be in trumpet range of everybody. So I think that they probably actually shared command. And I think that Varro was just got blamed for the defeat. He, we are told, shamefully fled later. Well, if he shamefully fled, how come the Senate never prosecuted him and actually sent out a deputation to thank him for his work and welcome him back to Rome? That's not how you would treat a disgraced commander. Anyway, so the hammer block of Romans goes forwards and meets the front of this crescent, which then slowly starts to get pushed into a straight line. Now, of course, if the crescent was the same width as the Roman block pushing at it, then it would get thicker as it gets compressed into a straight line, and then would get thinner again as it gets pushed into a bulge going the other way. It would become a thin, long sack. And as these men get pushed back further and further, the stalwart, steady columns that were very, very deep of very good troops, very experienced and heavily armored troops, just staying where they were, could also act to shepherd the Romans more and more into the sack, because as they go forwards, they expose, more and more and more of these veteran troops either side. And well, if you're a Roman towards the edge, are you going to want to take those on your own? No. And besides, everyone else is going forwards against the Spanish and the Celts who are giving ground. So they were just led further and further into this sack. And then, according to Polybius, every one of the Africans either side just turned on the spot 90 degrees. So these 2 columns that were facing that way then were facing that way. So they became broad things and were able to just go slam into either side. Meanwhile, there was a cavalry engagement, and on one flank next to the river, we are told by every single writer the same thing happened, which was that the cavalry units just hit each other smack on, head on, and could not do what cavalry normally do, which is whirl around and skirmish. Instead, they just came to a halt. There wasn't room to maneuver. Some men actually had to dismount to fight. Others were dragged from their saddles. And there was just a brutal man against man fight on the spot. And it could be that the reason that the Roman cavalry never plays any further part in the battle, we're not told what happened to them, is that they were almost all annihilated, and it was no longer a functioning unit. The superior and outnumbering Carthaginian cavalry just took them out. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Numidian cavalry, which were light skirmishers, Numidians were from North Africa. They were sort of like, a bit like the Berbers of today, sort of Arabic-looking people. They just whirled around, keeping the Latin cavalry busy until the victorious Carthaginian cavalry from the other flank was able to ride up, see off the Latin cavalry. The commander Hasdrubal said, "Right, you just keep them busy, just keep them routing, just follow them, and I'm not going to follow them, pursue them, because I'm going to fall onto the back of the Romans, closing the sack." So you have the Spanish and Gauls as this flexible bag opening. You've got the stiff fasteners, if you like, of the spearmen closing, and anyone trying to get out and flee is going to run straight into the Carthaginian cavalry, sealing the trap. And it was an absolute slaughter, because in order to fight, you have to have room. You need to have physical room. Now, the Romans were in dense formations to start with, because that's how they like to fight. Their shields were wide enough to cover the man and interlocked with the shield of the man right next to you. So you were at your optimum fighting distance, just like that. So if you got crushed even a little bit, suddenly you can't wield your weapons very well. And they were crushed completely. There were men having the breath just crushed out of them. And there was nowhere to run. And the slaughter was horrendous. How many were killed? Numbers vary enormously. It could have been, well, the lowest number is about 45,000 and the highest number is about 70,000. But this is men killed all in a deep press. And it has occurred to me that someone sitting on his horse near the center of where the battle took place, just after it had concluded, that man probably saw more corpses than anyone has ever seen in a single glance. At the first day of the Somme, for instance, in World War I, yes, the British alone lost 60,000, but that's 60,000 casualties, not deaths. It was only about 20,000 deaths, and they were scattered over many, many miles of countryside, and they were in bunkers and in trenches and in shell holes, and they were covered in mud. There was no one place, even at the end of the first day of the Somme, where one man could stand and see 70,000 corpses.
Wow.
But at the end of this battle, there was just a staggering sea of death. And what a fellowship of death it was. They killed 1/5 of the adult male population of Rome in a few hours. They killed something like 1/3 of the Roman Senate. And they collected up the rings from all the dead senators, put them in a bag and took them to Carthage and scattered them on the floor of the Senate to say, look what we've done. It was a graphic way of illustrating the scale of the victory. And following this battle, the big controversy is, well, why didn't he then immediately take Rome when he could? Actually, one, he probably couldn't. There were still 2 other Roman armies in the field. If he marched on Rome, which was extremely difficult to take, he had no siege equipment, he would have robbed himself of his big advantage, which was his tactical mobility. He would have been just sitting in front of a fortified place. The Romans could have surrounded him and then starved him. Besides, so it would have been a very bad move, but actually he had another much better move, because after Cannae, suddenly all those allied states, those subjugated states I talked to you earlier about, were flocking to him. They were saying, oh yeah, great. The second city of Italy, which was Capua, they said they sided with Hannibal right then. So he was receiving deputations from left, right, and center and striking alliances and billeting his men here and there. So he had an awful lot to do, and it was useful work.
Wow.
So that was the Battle of Cannae, 216 August.
Amazing, Nicholas. Thank you so much for taking us through that. I think, as you just mentioned, the scale of death is just unfathomable. And wow, just amazing. I think
And the tactics as well.
yeah, the level of military strategy involved in this is a lot more sophisticated and deep than I would have ever imagined. Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Pleasure, as always.